Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why sometimes your brain just seems to get in its own way, even when you know what you should be doing? Well, this new study has some fascinating insights into how we see the world and how that can actually mess with our own judgments. Imagine you're looking at a scene like your living room. You know exactly what you can see from where you're standing, but what if someone else is in the room looking at the same scene from a totally different spot? Sometimes just knowing they have a different view can actually make it harder for you to judge what you see, even if their view has nothing to do with your task. This is called altercentric interference. And it's been a puzzle for scientists for a long time. They've been asking two big questions. Is this interference a sign that our brains are actually trying to understand what the other person is thinking and seeing something called mentalizing? Or is it just a more basic automatic brain process that happens whether we want it to or not, dealing with things like attention and space? And is this process something we choose to do, or does it just happen automatically? Like your brain doing it in the background. This research tried to untangle these tricky questions. Think about it. It's really hard to study these things when the way we normally test them might be mixing up different ideas. For example, if you have to switch between thinking about your view and the other person's view, are you slower because you're struggling with understanding their perspective, or just because you have to switch tasks, which is always a bit mentally taxing? These experiments were designed to carefully pull apart these different elements. So, what did they do? They created a special kind of task. Imagine a scene with a little Lego-like figure, an avatar, and some red balls. From your point of view, you can see all the balls, but the avatar is facing a wall, so some balls are hidden from its view. On each trial, you have to judge if a number you see matches how many balls are visible from your perspective. The clever part is how they set up the scenarios to create what they call consistent and inconsistent trials. In consistent trials, the avatar sees the same number of balls as you do. In inconsistent trials, the avatar sees a different number of balls than you do, even though you're only supposed to be thinking about your own view. This setup is key because it allowed them to control for a really confusing factor: the direction the avatar was facing. In older experiments, the direction the avatar was facing was tied to what it could see, which made it hard to tell if the interference was from understanding its view or just from our attention being pulled in a certain direction. They ran 3 experiments, each with about 100 people. The first experiment focused on task switching. Some people had to switch between thinking about their own view and the avatar's view on different trials, while others only ever focused on their own view. This helped them see if the interference was due to the effort of switching tasks or something else. The second experiment then started to remove the agent, the avatar itself. Sometimes the avatar was there, and sometimes it wasn't, even though the scene looked similar. This was to see if the presence of a social figure was necessary for the interference to happen. Finally, the third experiment took it a step further. In one group, there was never an avatar, only a simple block that looked similar in size and color. They wanted to see if the interference effect would still occur even with no social cue at all. And here is the mind-blowing part. Across all these different setups, even when there was no avatar, no explicit instructions to think about the other person, and no directional cues, people were still slower to judge their own view when the scene had a different perspective implied. This means the effect wasn't about choosing to understand someone else's mind, nor was it just about attention being pulled in a direction. The researchers concluded that altercentric interference is an involuntary process. It's not about trying to understand someone's mind or even about attention being pulled in a specific direction. Instead, it seems to be a more basic response to the structure of the scene itself. Our brains are sensitive to how a scene is laid out, especially when there are barriers, like that wall, that create different visible areas. When the distribution of things you can see is different from what could be seen from another perspective, even if that other perspective is irrelevant to your task, your brain just slows down a bit. This suggests it's a domain general process, meaning it is not specialized just for social interaction, but rather a fundamental way our visual system processes complex, partitioned environments. This really challenges previous ideas. For a long time, findings like those from Sampson and colleagues, where replacing an avatar with a simple rectangle eliminated the interference, led people to believe the effect was tied to the presence of an agent. But here, in a more carefully controlled environment with richer scenes, the effect persisted even with a simple blot. The original Sampson experiment might have been too simple, or the instructions to ignore the rectangle might have inadvertently highlighted it, making it a boundary condition. The studies by O'Grady and colleagues were important precursors. They also used an occlusion paradigm to separate perspective from direction. However, their experiments had a slightly different setup that might have still confounded task, switching costs with voluntary perspective taking. The current study specifically addresses that by creating a fixed group that never had to switch perspectives or receive explicit cues, And they still found the interference. This is a crucial difference. So let's recap the story. The big question was whether altercentric interference comes from mentalizing, understanding another mind, or submentalizing more basic processes like attention and spatial layout, and whether it is voluntary, something we choose to do, or involuntary, something that just happens. The experiment systematically removed each of these factors. They got rid of explicit instructions and task switching. They removed the avatar on some trials. And finally, they removed the avatar entirely for a whole session. Every time the interference effect, a slight slowdown in response, persisted. Experiment 1 showed that even when you only ever focus on your own view and don't get explicit cues, the interference effect is still there. This means it's not just voluntary, you're not choosing to do it for the fun of it. Experiment 2 showed that it doesn't even matter if the avatar is on the screen or not in any given trial. The slowdown happened whether the avatar was there or absent, as long as the scene structure implied a different perspective. This really starts to poke holes in the idea that you need a social agent for this to happen. And the final nail in the coffin for the mentalizing as the sole driver idea comes from experiment 3. When you remove the avatar completely for an entire session and replace it with a simple block that has no direction, the interference effect still happens. This is the most powerful finding. It means the interference is driven by the spatial layout of the scene. Specifically, how barriers create differently visible areas. It's not about inferring what another person sees, but about how your own visual system processes that kind of partitioned space. So, what does this all mean? It means altercentric interference is likely an involuntary submentalizing process. It's automatic and relies on general visual processing, not on understanding minds. The specific mechanism seems to be tied to stimulus salience and spatial geometry. Think of it like this. When a scene is divided by an obstacle and targets are unevenly distributed between the visible and hidden parts, your brain just takes a little longer to confirm your judgment. It's a fundamental property of how we process visual information in complex environments. This doesn't mean mentalizing doesn't happen or isn't important in other situations. It just means for this specific type of interference, in these controlled experiments, understanding another person's mind isn't the driver. It's a bit like how sometimes you might notice a random object in your peripheral vision and it distracts you slightly even if it has nothing to do with what you're trying to do. This phenomenon is more about the visual system's response to structured scene. Now, like any study, there are limitations. Doing these experiments online means they can't perfectly control how well participants follow instructions on viewing distance or how attentive they are. Future research could do this in a lab. Also, they only looked at behavioral responses, how fast people answered. Using tools like eye tracking could show when in the process this interference happens. And it's important to remember this specific research focused on level -1 visual perspective, taking just judging what's visible. It might not tell us the whole story about more complex forms of understanding what others are thinking. But overall, this is a really important study. It clarifies that a phenomenon long thought to be about social cognition understanding other minds might actually be a more general visual processing mechanism. This could have implications for how we design AI systems, for example. If understanding what other agents can see is about processing spatial structure, we can build computers that are better at that. What do you all think about these findings? Does it change how you see how your own brain works? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this breakdown helpful, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to Rubin's Mind Lab for more science simplified, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the fascinating world of psychology. Thanks for watching, and well, see you next time.